The pencil trembled in Sergeant Joseph Morelli's weathered hands as he sat in his barracks at Camp Heraford, Texas, that April evening in 1943. Through the window, electric lights blazed across the endless Texas plains like fallen stars, and he could hear the distant rumble of tractors working the fields even after sunset. The words he was writing to his mother in Sicily seemed impossible, yet they flowed onto the paper with the weight of truth. "Mama," he wrote, "they feed us like we are guests, not prisoners. White bread every day, meat, vegetables, more food than we saw in 2 years of war. I cannot understand these Americans." Morelli was among the first wave of Italian prisoners to reach American shores, part of a human tide that would eventually swell to 51,000 men. These soldiers had surrendered in the scorching deserts of North Africa when General Giovanni Messi's First Army finally collapsed in May 1943, their supply lines severed and their German allies treating them as expendable. They had expected death, or at best brutal forced labor. Instead, they discovered what thousands would later describe in letters home as quasi-paradiso, almost paradise. The end had come swiftly in Tunisia after months of impossible odds. No supplies arrived from Italy while British and American forces pressed from 2 directions. Among the 275,000 Axis troops who surrendered were approximately 50,000 Italians, men who would form the core of America's Italian prisoner population as more arrived from battles in Sicily and mainland Italy. Their journey from defeat to revelation began in the collection camps of Tunisia, where American military efficiency immediately impressed them. Medical examinations were thorough. Many received their first real medical care in years. New clothing replaced uniforms that were more patches than original fabric. But it was the food that stunned them most profoundly. After months of survival rations that barely kept them alive, the Americans provided white bread, canned meat, coffee with real sugar, and chocolate. The Liberty ships that carried them across the Atlantic were returning from delivering supplies to the European theater, and rather than sail back empty, they carried human cargo, up to 30,000 prisoners per month by summer 1943. The 2-week voyage across the Atlantic provided the first systematic contradiction of everything fascist propaganda had taught them. The ships themselves were monuments to American productivity, vessels mass-produced at rates Italy could never achieve. Italian prisoners discovered that radar equipment, which they had seen only on advanced British warships, was standard on American cargo ships. The ship's mess provided daily shock to their understanding of the world. American sailors had ice cream machines, unlimited coffee, fresh bread, and meat. They discarded food that would have been treasured in Italy, demonstrating resources beyond comprehension through casual waste. As Italian prisoners disembarked at ports like Norfolk, Virginia, they entered a world that exceeded their wildest imagination. The ports sprawled across thousands of acres with docks stretching for miles, dozens of ships loading and unloading simultaneously. Electric cranes lifted loads that would require dozens of men in Italy. But most striking was the civilian prosperity they witnessed. Parking lots filled with workers' automobiles. In Italy, only the wealthy owned cars. Every building blazed with electricity. Shops displayed goods that had vanished from Italian stores before the war even began. The prisoners traveled by passenger train, not cattle cars, riding in coaches with cushioned seats, electric lights, and dining cars. The journey into America's heartland revealed a nation of impossible wealth. Every small town had electricity, automobiles, and shops full of goods. Factories ran 3 shifts with electric power, and even rural farms had tractors and electrical lines stretching to the horizon. Camp Heraford was designated exclusively for Italian prisoners, encompassing 4 compounds with barracks, mess halls, and infirmaries surrounded by barbed wire fences monitored by armed guards. At its peak, it held 3,860 prisoners, with 2,580 Italian men, making it one of the primary centers for Italian prisoners in Texas. The camps exceeded Italian military standards in every way. Barracks had electric lights, hot showers, flush toilets, and heating. The hospitals contained equipment unavailable in Italy since before the war, including X-ray machines and modern surgical tools. To the Italian prisoners, the camps seemed almost paradise. They were kept in clean barracks, enjoyed hot showers, had an abundance of food, and could spend the money they earned from work at the local PX. The food overwhelmed them completely, 3 meals daily with meat, vegetables, bread, milk, and often dessert. Special meals for holidays exceeded anything they had known even before the war. Kitchen workers reported throwing away more food daily than their families in Italy received weekly. Everything changed dramatically on September 8, 1943, when Italy surrendered and signed an armistice with the Allies. Marshal Pietro Badoglio's government switched sides, declaring war on Germany on October 13. The Prime Minister instructed Italian prisoners to collaborate with the Allies, and beginning in February 1944, the United States Army Service Corps offered Italian prisoners the opportunity to join what became known as Italian service units. They could remain prisoners or volunteer for Italian service units to work alongside Americans in non-combat roles. The response was overwhelming. Of the 51,000 Italian prisoners being held in the United States, over 45,000 joined the service units and were sent to places with labor shortages across the country. They signed pledges to assist against their former German allies and received privileges that transformed their entire experience. Though officially still classified as prisoners, they wore uniforms differentiated only by a patch reading Italy on the left sleeve and garrison cap, and received a monthly stipend of $24, with 1/3 paid in cash and the rest in scrip for base purchases. In California, where the war remained palpable through 1945 because of intense Pacific fighting, Italian prisoners working in support of the war effort were received most enthusiastically. The state's large Italian-American population, established since the gold rush era as fishermen, farmers, and winemakers, embraced the prisoners. The most amazing story was of Italian prisoners stationed on Angel Island who held regular dances in a hall in San Francisco that they rented with their own money, organizing Saturday night dances that became major social events with American women attending, chaperoned but eager to meet the Italian soldiers. Italian prisoners of war worked in California's agricultural fields, witnessing farming on a scale that defied comprehension. Single farms were larger than Italian provinces, and mechanical harvesters did the work of hundreds of men. Italian service unit members became essential contributors to the American war effort, loading ships for D-Day, harvesting crops that would have rotted without their labor, and maintaining military equipment with expertise gained in North Africa. The Italian service units accounted for over 90 million man-days of labor in the United States from 1943 to 1945, saving the government an estimated $230 million. At the Brooklyn Army Terminal, Italian prisoners loaded supplies for the liberation of Europe with genuine enthusiasm, knowing every shipment brought Italy closer to freedom from German occupation. In agricultural areas, they saved harvests crucial to feeding both America and its allies. By June 1943, over 14,500 Italian prisoners resided in camps throughout the United States, and as the program expanded after Italy's surrender, Italian workers became indispensable in many sectors. Love flourished despite military regulations. Italian prisoners met American women at church services, approved social events, and through work. In Ogden, Utah, a local church held chaperone dances each weekend for the prisoners, and Italian-American families could visit on Sundays. These relationships faced significant obstacles since military regulations prohibited marriages between prisoners and American citizens. Yet romance found ways around the barriers. Sympathetic priests performed ceremonies, couples maintained relationships through letters, and many women followed their Italian boyfriends to Italy after repatriation, marrying there before returning to America as wives of legal immigrants. The Italian-American community played a crucial role in areas with large Italian-American populations. Prisoners found surrogate families who invited them for Sunday dinners, helped them write letters home, and maintained connections that lasted decades after the war ended. Christmas 1943 provided profound emotional impact when American churches and civic organizations sent packages to camps containing cigarettes, chocolate, and toiletries, luxuries even for American civilians. Local communities organized dinners and celebrations, and at Camp Heraford, local churches performed Italian Christmas carols while Catholic churches held midnight mass in Latin and Italian. The Christmas feast included turkey, ham, multiple side dishes, and desserts, abundance that Italians hadn't seen since before World War I. This kindness toward enemies shattered the last remnants of fascist propaganda about American weakness. Italian prisoners wrote home describing American generosity that only a nation certain of victory could show. By 1944, thousands enrolled in educational programs, studying English, American history, mathematics, and vocational skills. Universities provided correspondence courses, camps showed Hollywood films, and published newspapers that evolved from simple news sheets to sophisticated publications discussing democracy and post-war reconstruction. Italian prisoners built theaters, formed orchestras, and created art that remains in many locations today. At various camps, they constructed elaborate fountains, painted murals, and built chapels that still draw visitors, not crude prisoner crafts, but professional quality work that demonstrated Italian artistic tradition. When news of the June 6, 1944 Normandy invasion reached the camps, Italian prisoners celebrated wildly. These were their former enemies landing in France, but also the liberators who would free Italy from German occupation. Italian prisoners worked extra shifts loading supplies, painting messages on boxes, for the liberation of Rome, death to the Nazis. When Rome fell on June 4, 1944, Italian prisoners and Italian Americans held joint celebrations across America. Former enemies had become allies in the fight against Nazi Germany, and at Camp Heraford, prisoners and local residents held a victory mass that drew thousands. Throughout captivity, Italian prisoners experienced genuine American kindness. When prisoners received news of family deaths from bombing in Italy, American guards and commanders attended memorial services. Local families adopted prisoners who had lost everything, ensuring they weren't alone during holidays. Medical treatment particularly affected prisoners. Italian doctors worked alongside American medical staff, learning techniques and using equipment unavailable in Italy for years. Prisoners received operations and treatments that would have been available only to the wealthy in Italy. The separation between German and Italian prisoners became more pronounced after Italy's surrender. While German prisoners often maintained Nazi ideology, Italians embraced their new status as co-belligerents, working enthusiastically for Allied victory. In March 1944, the U.S. military sent 1,800 Italian service unit members to Boston. First housed at Camp McKay in South Boston, the prisoners received frosty treatment from locals, as Boston's Italian-American community initially viewed prisoners with suspicion, fearing they would damage the community's reputation as loyal Americans. But transformation came quickly as Italian prisoners proved themselves industrious workers at the Boston port of embarkation. They sang in church choirs, cooked for festivals, and introduced authentic Italian cuisine to second-generation Italian Americans who had never tasted real Italian food. Due to rising tensions with the South Boston community, 1,300 of the service unit members transferred to Pedex Island in Boston Harbor, where they enjoyed more freedom with trustees allowed Sunday boat trips into Boston's North End, often dining with Italian-American families. Italian prisoners witnessed American industrial and agricultural production that defied comprehension. In California's Central Valley, they saw single farms producing more than entire Italian provinces. Mechanical harvesters processed in hours what would take weeks in Italy, and they watched as perfect fruit was discarded for minor blemishes. Entire crops were sometimes plowed under to maintain prices, waste that would have prevented starvation in Italy, but here demonstrated unlimited production capacity. The casual attitude toward abundance stunned them most. Workers threw away half-eaten lunches, left lights burning in empty rooms, and drove automobiles to work, all unthinkable in wartime Italy, where families survived on meager rations. Men were put to work in the fields or on fishing boats, earning $8 a month. Even this modest wage seemed generous to men who had nothing, and they saved carefully to send money home after the war. Italian prisoners left permanent marks on American culture. They introduced bocce ball to communities that still play today, taught Americans to make authentic pasta and pizza, helping launch what would become a multi-billion-dollar industry. Their decorative work, fountains, murals, and chapels remains in dozens of locations. Camp newspapers published by prisoners showed remarkable transformation, with articles evolving from news about Italy to discussions of democracy, American farming techniques, and plans for post-war reconstruction. These publications circulated among camps, spreading ideas about democratic governance and modern methods. On July 16, 1944, the 38th and 40th Italian Quartermaster Services companies arrived at Rock Island Arsenal by train from Pine Camp, New York. They performed maintenance and support work that proved so valuable that commanders requested delays in repatriation after the war ended. At agricultural sites, Italian prisoners demonstrated expertise from generations of farming tradition, introducing techniques that improved American agriculture. Their work in canneries, shipyards, and military depots freed thousands of Americans for combat duty. The volunteers in the Italian service units also freed up American soldiers who would have performed supporting roles to serve in combat, and due to their assistance, fewer American men had to be drafted. The scale of the Italian prisoner experience in America was remarkable. At its peak in May 1945, a total of 425,871 prisoners were held in the U.S., 371,683 Germans, 50,273 Italians, and 3,915 Japanese. The Italian prisoners numbered 51,000 and were placed in 21 camps across 18 states. Their labor contribution was immense: 90 million man-days of labor, $230 million saved in labor costs, thousands of Americans freed for combat duty, and critical harvests saved from rotting. The integration success was extraordinary. 45,000 joined Italian service units, less than 1% attempted escape, thousands maintained correspondence with American families post-war, and many returned as legal immigrants. Repatriation began in late 1945, but proceeded slowly because America needed their labor for the transition to peacetime. Many Italian prisoners didn't want to leave, having found friendship and opportunity in America while Italy remained destroyed and occupied. When departures began, entire communities turned out to say goodbye. At Camp Heraford and other camps, local newspapers wrote about losing friends, not prisoners. Relationships formed during captivity, both romantic and platonic, faced painful separation. Between December 1945 and July 1946, Italian prisoners returned to Italy carrying knowledge of American democracy, agricultural techniques, and industrial methods. They became inadvertent architects of Italy's post-war reconstruction, implementing American approaches learned during captivity. As promised, many former prisoners returned to America as legal immigrants, sponsored by employers who valued their skills, families they had befriended, or women they had married. Thousands made new lives in America, and these immigrants succeeded remarkably. They founded businesses, particularly in food industries and import-export trade between Italy and America, maintaining connections between the nations that facilitated post-war recovery and trade. Former prisoners and their descendants achieved prominence in American society, becoming judges, business leaders, military officers, and community leaders. Their children, raised with both Italian and American heritage, bridged cultures in unique ways. Today, physical reminders of the Italian prisoner experience survive across America. At Camp Heraford, a small chapel built by prisoners in 1945 still stands, constructed to honor 5 men who died at the camp. It features concrete made to look like marble and serves as a pilgrimage site for descendants. Bocce courts from California to Massachusetts trace their origins to Italian prisoners who introduced the game. Italian festivals in unlikely places like Texas and Utah celebrate the prisoner legacy. Recipes taught by prisoner cooks remain family traditions, but the true monuments are the families and communities transformed by this experience. Business relationships established during the 1940s continue through 3rd and 4th generations, and sister city relationships between American and Italian towns originated from prisoner connections. Historians recognize the Italian prisoner experience as remarkably successful in transforming enemies into allies. Unlike traditional re-education through propaganda, Italian prisoners were converted through experience, witnessing American democracy and prosperity firsthand. Several factors contributed to this success. Italy's surrender in 1943 changed prisoner status from enemy to co-belligerent. Italian-American communities provided cultural bridges. Catholic faith shared by many Italians and Americans created bonds. Italy's pre-war economic struggles made prisoners receptive to alternatives, and American abundance and kindness contradicted fascist propaganda. The contrast with German prisoners is instructive. While Germans often maintained Nazi ideology despite similar treatment, Italians almost universally embraced American values. This difference reflected cultural factors and the timing of Italy's surrender. The Italian prisoner experience influenced both nations profoundly. For America, it demonstrated the power of kindness and prosperity in winning hearts and minds. For Italy, returning prisoners brought knowledge that contributed to post-war democratic development and economic recovery. Former prisoners helped establish business connections between Italy and America that facilitated trade and investment. They introduced American agricultural and industrial techniques that modernized Italian production. Most importantly, they carried memories of democracy functioning successfully, providing models for Italy's post-war government. The program succeeded because it relied on demonstration rather than indoctrination. Italian prisoners saw American society functioning effectively while treating enemies with dignity, witnessed production capacity that made victory inevitable, and experienced living standards that exposed fascist promises as fantasies. Starting in the 1970s, former Italian prisoners organized reunions in America. These gatherings celebrated transformation and friendship rather than captivity. The 1988 reunion at Camp Heraford drew hundreds of former prisoners and thousands of Americans who had known them. Veterans spoke of gratitude for American kindness, of lives transformed by captivity, of enemies who became family. Their testimonies emphasized that their imprisonment had been fortunate, opening doors to democracy, prosperity, and friendship. At these reunions, elderly men who had arrived as Mussolini soldiers embraced American guards who had become lifelong friends. Their grandchildren, American and Italian, played together, living proof of reconciliation. Why did Italian prisoners call American camps almost paradise? Not because captivity was pleasant, but because it revealed possibilities they never imagined. They discovered that prosperity came from freedom rather than conquest, that diversity created strength rather than weakness, that democracy functioned better than dictatorship. They witnessed ordinary Americans living better than Italian aristocracy, saw workers owning automobiles, farms using machinery, and factories producing abundance. They experienced kindness from enemies that their own government never showed them. The paradise was relative. Compared to years of war, starvation, and propaganda lies, American camps offered food, safety, and dignity. Compared to what awaited in bombed, occupied Italy, America represented hope and opportunity. The Italian prisoner experience enriched American culture permanently. Pizza, now a multi-billion-dollar industry, was popularized partly by prisoner cooks who taught Americans authentic preparation. Espresso culture, decades before Starbucks, was introduced by Italian prisoners to communities that had never tasted real coffee. In small towns across America, Italian festivals celebrate connections born from the prisoner experience. In Hereford, Texas, the annual prisoner reunion became a community tradition. In California's Central Valley, wineries founded by former prisoners or their descendants produce wines using techniques brought from Italy. The linguistic impact was significant. Thousands of Americans learned Italian from prisoners, creating a generation of Italian speakers who would facilitate post-war business and cultural exchange. Italian words entered local vocabularies, particularly in food and agriculture. Beyond the immediate $230 million in labor value, Italian prisoners contributed to long-term economic connections. Former prisoners who became American citizens or maintained business relationships facilitated billions in trade between Italy and America. The agricultural techniques they learned and implemented in Italy helped that nation's post-war agricultural recovery, and the industrial methods they observed influenced Italian manufacturing, contributing to the Italian miracle of the 1950s and 1960s. American businesses benefited from connections with former prisoners who understood both cultures. Import-export firms, food companies, and manufacturing partnerships flourished through relationships begun in prison camps. Studies of former Italian prisoners revealed remarkable psychological outcomes. Unlike many prisoner populations who suffered lasting trauma, Italian prisoners in America showed lower rates of depression and PTSD than Italian soldiers who weren't captured. Psychologists attribute this to excellent treatment exceeding expectations, meaningful work providing purpose, social integration reducing isolation, educational opportunities offering hope, and the transformation from enemy to ally status after Italy's surrender. The psychological impact extended to families. Children of former prisoners often reported that their fathers spoke positively of their captivity, unusual for war experiences. This positive framework influenced family dynamics and international perspectives for generations. The story of Italian prisoners in America demonstrates war's capacity for unexpected transformation. Men who arrived as Mussolini's soldiers left as democracy's advocates. Enemies became friends, prisoners became partners, and many ultimately became Americans. Through simple acts, sharing food, providing medical care, allowing religious worship, enabling correspondence with families, America converted adversaries more effectively than any propaganda could achieve. The Italian prisoners witnessed American society at its best and wanted that prosperity and freedom for their own nation. Their contribution went beyond labor. They enriched American culture, strengthened Italian-American communities, and built bridges between nations that endure today. Their descendants, whether in Italy or America, embody the possibility of reconciliation and friendship after conflict. The Italian prisoners found their quasi-paradiso not in the camps themselves, but in the revelation of what society could achieve through democracy and freedom. They returned to Italy carrying seeds of transformation that would help build a democratic nation from fascism's ruins. In the end, 51,000 Italian soldiers captured in North Africa discovered in American captivity what Mussolini's empire could never provide: dignity, opportunity, and hope. They called it paradise, not because it was perfect, but because it showed them perfection was possible. Through their transformation, enemies became family, and two nations found friendship that endures across generations. Their legacy reminds us that even in war's darkest moments, humanity can prevail, that kindness can conquer where weapons cannot, that showing enemies a better way may transform them into friends. The Italian prisoners who found paradise in America proved that reconciliation is possible, that democracy's example is powerful, and that treating enemies with dignity can yield victory more lasting than any battlefield triumph. The camps are mostly gone now, returned to farmland, or developed into suburbs. But in Heraford, Texas, a small chapel stands. In California, bocce courts echo with Italian voices. In countless American communities, families trace their roots to an Italian soldier who found paradise in captivity and chose to stay. They came as warriors of a failed empire and left as builders of a democratic future. They arrived as prisoners and discovered paradise. And in that discovery, two nations found a friendship that neither war nor time could break.